Hi there, this is Criterion from Criterion Films and welcome to another video. This one's a bit daft, granted all my videos are a bit daft, but this is just going through my Criterion collection decade by decade and actually seeing how many I have of a certain decade. Because the decade that actually won this competition, if you like, isn't perhaps the decade that you might think, but I do have the most films from that decade in the Criterion collection. Obviously the Criterion collection is a fraction of my whole collection, so if there's decades that don't seem to have that many films, I probably do have them in different other labels. The top 4 decades probably won't be a surprise, but maybe the order might be, just from the perception of that decade. But again, the Criterion collection focuses on world cinema, so it's not just Hollywood, because obviously there's certain decades in Hollywood that are seen as the kind of better periods, better decades than other ones. So I have about 310, but that's probably counting films from box sets. So I've at least got over 200 odd Criterions. And this was kind of inspired because I happened to see a comment on another video about the Criterion collection, and they said that they order their Criterions in the actual year of the film was made rather than spine number. Because one thing about Criterion that's maybe a minor annoyance for me is sometimes just the artwork they use. Sometimes the spine number is really hard to read, and also if you're trying to find a film, unless you kind of know roughly where it is in your collection, it's sometimes a wee bit harder to find Criterion films. And I've actually found, since I've changed it to the year of production, you can just find films a lot easier, because you know, that one was made in 1985, so you just go straight to that area. So I'm probably going to leave them in year of production for a little while, rather than spine number, because it's also interesting, as I've done, go through the decades, and you almost have a nice history of cinema, and you can also see, I mean, obviously I'm nowhere near completing Criterion, I never will be, but it's interesting to see Criterion's kind of selection from those decades as well. So I've put the decades in order of how many that I have. So, in no surprise, in last place is the 2020s, which is only 3 years old, and I have no films from the 2020s in my Criterion collection, which won't come as any surprise to anybody, because modern films kind of pass me by. There's usually, unless it's specific films by specific filmmakers, I'll get to modern films at some point, but my backlog's big enough, and without these new modern films that you kids seem to talk about. So in 10th place is the 1920s, and I've just picked 3 films from each decade, just basically to show something. So we have The Phantom Carriage, Victor Sundstrom's magnificent silent film. This is from 1921, which I would highly recommend. From 1922, we have Haxan, which is the wonderful witchcraft film And it also includes Witchcraft Through the Ages from 1968, which is 76 minutes itself. And then we have Harold Lloyd in Safety Last from 1923. So next, in 9th place, is the 2010s. So I do have some films from the 21st century. So we have 2011's The Tree of Life by Terrence Malick. We have Wes Anderson's Moonrise Kingdom from 2012. Granted, most of the films I have from the 2000s and the 2010s are Wes Anderson films, because the Criterion seems to be trying to be complete on Wes Anderson films. And then 2017's 24 Frames, the only Kiarostami film that I have so far. And then next up is the 2000s, and I have a whopping 12 Criterions from the 2000s. 2001, Mulholland Drive. 2004, it's another Wes Anderson, The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou, with a powerfully moving end title sequence, and I don't know quite why it is, but it's quite moving. 2005, Terrence Malick again, The New World. And then in 7th place is the 1930s, again with just the 12. I actually thought I would have more from the 1930s. Obviously I do, as I said, in other labels. We have Vampire from 1932. I always kind of think this is from the 1920s, but it's 1932. Ernst Lubitsch, Designed for Living, which is basically about a threesome. Yep, it's before the Hays Code. And one of the gems of the collection, Holiday, 1938, George Cukor, Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, the same team that would do Philadelphia Story the year after, even though I think Holiday is the far better film. Even though, as I've said before, it's completely predictable, but it doesn't matter because it's absolutely fantastic. And then we have the 1990s in 6th place, and I actually have 24 films from the 1990s. The 1990s has its knockers, but certainly for American cinema, you could argue it's the last great decade of American cinema. Certainly kind of independent cinema. But from 1991, with David Mamet's Homicide, which really needs a Blu-ray upgrade. It's absolutely magnificent with Joe Mantegna, one of the best American films about race. 1993, Guillermo del Toro's debut Kronos with Federico Luppi. In 1996, the Dardennes, not debut, but the Dardennes as the Dardennes, and all that lack of style that goes with it. Debut, La Promesse, 1996. So then after the 90s, the 80s are next up, and I have 29 from the 80s. There's a Ballad of Gregorio Cortez, one of the most underrated films in the collection. This is a Region A, but if you haven't seen this one, you should definitely check out Edward James Olmos. Absolutely spectacularly good film. Shklovsky's Blind Chance, arguably his best of his early films. I was going to say his early funny films, but that's not really the case. 1995, Come and See, greatest war film ever made. One of the best covers Criterion's ever done. And then, as I say, the top four might be a bit predictable, but perhaps not the order they're in. So in fourth place, it's the 1940s with 36 titles. 1942, To Be or Not to Be, maybe the greatest comedy ever made. Another Ernst Lubitsch masterpiece, sadly Carol Lombard's last film. 1947, Ride the Pink Horse, directed and starring actor Robert Montgomery. Really strange little noir set in Mexico, with a strange bizarre title, but it's well worth checking out. Also in 1947, Nightmare Alley. I've still to see the Del Toro reimagining, which I will at some point, but I've always loved the Tyrone Power film, and it's good that this finally got a Blu-ray release. This is a Region A, but Signal 1 have released it in Region B in the UK. And then at number 3, it's the 70s. Thought they may have been higher, but they're in third place with 41 films. Investigating Your Citizen Above Suspicion by Ilo Petri and Volonte. Brilliant Volonte performance. This is from 1970. I've talked about this film till I'm blue in the face, but I'll keep talking about it. The Parallax View from 1974. My favourite of Pakula's Paranoid trilogy with Clute and All the President's Men. Arguably Warren Beatty's finest performance. And a classic 70s ending. And then 1979, Christ Stopped at Eboli by Francesco Rossi, starring Volonte. One of those films that blew me away, even though I have no idea why. It's about 3.5 hours long, but it's just absolutely beautiful and wonderful. And then in second place, it's the 50s with 56. 1950, Gunfighter, one of my favourite westerns of all time. Only 84 minutes, doesn't need to be any longer. A wonderful film about legend and myth and living up to legends and myths. 1957, Wild Strawberries by Bergman. Arguably my favourite Bergman. Gets more powerful and more moving the older you get. 1958, Elevator to the Gallows, or Lift to the Scaffold as I always call it, by Louis Malle, Jean Moreau. Louis Malle made this his film debut when he was 24 years old. Pretty impressive. So if you're doing the maths, that means the decade that I have the most Criterions is actually the 1960s, which again, certainly in American cinema, perhaps doesn't get talked about the way the 50s and the 70s and the 40s and the 30s do. But obviously for world cinema, the 60s was pretty large. And for the kind of birth of American independent cinema, the 60s was pretty big. So there's a whopping 91 films in the 60s that I have in my collection. So in 1960, Kurosawa's Bad Sleep Well, one of the many Kurosawas that needs a Blu-ray release. 1962, Brunel's Exterminating Angel. Really need to rewatch all my Brunel films. But Exterminating Angel has always kind of been my favourite, just for the absurdity and the brilliance of it. And finally, another 1963 film. Another one like The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez that I would urge people to pick up if they haven't already. This is a Region A Blu-ray. Marcello Mastroianni, not as Marcello Mastroianni, and Mario Monicelli's just amazing film about small town tweed factory and the union organizer played by Mastroianni. It's funny, it's sad, it's brutal, it's just absolutely fantastic. So out of all the films that I've just kind of shown, The Organizer and The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez, I would highly recommend. I mean, I'd recommend all of them, but certainly those two are kind of some of the most underrated, absolute masterpieces in the Criterion collection that I've at least seen. But again, I'm not Criterion complete. I'll never be Criterion complete. But it was just a fun, might not have been fun for you, but it was a kind of fun exercise just to actually go through the decades and see how many films I actually had in the decades. And like I say, I do find organising the Criterions by decade rather than spine number, they're actually easier to find. But we'll see how long that lasts. I might change it all back to spine numbers. If not having them in spine order doesn't drive me crazy. But yeah, a fun exercise for me. I don't know whether it was for you, but I hope it was at least a little bit interesting. So thanks very much for watching. Please let me know in the comments below what your favourite decade of Criterions are. And hopefully you'll join me again for slightly more sensible videos. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying farewell.